Welcome to the deep dive. We have an absolute mountain of material to get through today, and I am genuinely thrilled you're joining us for this one.
Yeah, it is a dense stack of notes today.
It really is. We are looking at unclassified documents, intelligence analysis, and, well, specifically, we're working through a highly detailed transcript of a recent interview with a former CIA spy.
Right.
And this individual is just completely breaking down the modern landscape of global geopolitics, institutional transparency, and really the terrifying reality of modern warfare.
Terrifying is definitely the word.
Yeah. And this is all set against the backdrop of those massive geopolitical events we've seen recently. Specifically, the unprecedented U.S. actions regarding the rendition of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela, and then that heavy bombardment of Iran around mid-2025.
Exactly.
So our mission for you today is to unpack the hidden layers of these global conflicts. We're going to decode how intelligence is actually gathered in the field, how it gets processed through these massive bureaucratic engines, and, how it's occasionally manipulated behind closed doors.
Yeah, to achieve very specific strategic ends.
Right, because ultimately the goal of this deep dive is to help you develop what the intelligence community calls influence literacy. We want you to be able to navigate the modern fog of war without feeling completely overwhelmed.
And that concept, influence literacy, it's really a vital survival skill in this modern information ecosystem. But before we get into the mechanics of that, I think we absolutely need to establish the framework of our analysis today.
Good point. We have to do the disclaimer.
Yeah, we have to. The source material we're pulling from today contains some highly politically charged perspectives. The text gets into very specific, critical analysis of figures like Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Benjamin Netanyahu, and even media commentators like Tucker Carlson.
It covers everybody.
It does. The former intelligence officer in this transcript is dissecting all of their actions, their policies, and the geopolitical shockwaves from those policies. So I want to be unequivocally clear with you right now. We are not taking any political sides today. We're not endorsing any of the policies discussed, and we are certainly not validating the political opinions or partisan leanings presented in the text.
Right. Our objective is purely analytical. We're just examining the framework provided by this intelligence expert. We're looking at the geopolitical chessboard exactly as it's presented in the source material.
Exactly. We're going to analyze the moves, the theoretical motivations, and the strategic outcomes. But we are not picking a team.
We are strictly here to read the board. So, okay, let's unpack this. The central kind of paradigm-shifting premise from this former CIA officer is that World War III has already begun.
We're in it right now.
We are in it. But it looks absolutely nothing like the history books told us it would look. We aren't looking at, massive uniformed armies clashing in trench warfare across Europe.
No, it's a completely different paradigm.
To understand what modern global conflict actually looks like, we have to start with the inciting incidents from the analysis. We're talking about the U.S. military rendering Nicolas Maduro out of Caracas and the subsequent highly aggressive bombing campaign in Iran in June of 2025.
The one that notably included the targeted assassination of the Ayatollah.
Right. And those two highly kinetic events are the focal points of this massive intelligence discrepancy.
Yeah, the core conflict the ex-CIA spy points out is the gulf between the public justification for these actions and the internal bureaucratic reality that was documented just months prior.
Which is wild when you actually look at the timeline.
It is. The narrative presented to the public was that the bombing of Iran was an absolute, unavoidable necessity to stop military-grade uranium enrichment. The administration framed it as an imminent weapons of mass destruction scenario.
They said they needed immediate, overwhelming force.
Exactly. But when you examine the publicly available intelligence documents, specifically the ODNI threat assessment, that entire narrative fractures in a really spectacular way.
Okay, let's pause there for a second. For those who might not track the alphabet soup of the intelligence community, ODNI stands for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence.
Right.
This isn't some fringe think tank. The ODNI was created after 9/11 specifically to act as the supreme integrating body for the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus.
And that context is so crucial. Every single year, the 16 different elements of the intelligence community. So organizations like the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and all those specialized technical branches.
Like the satellite guys.
Right, let's clarify those.
Yeah.
Because they come into play heavily later. You have the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, building and operating spy satellites. You have the NGA analyzing the imagery, and the NSA handling global signals intelligence.
All heavy hitters?
All of them. And they all have to submit their individual assessments of the most pressing threats to the ODNI. The ODNI then synthesizes this massive influx of data into one master document, the Annual Threat Assessment.
Which is what Congress uses to allocate billions of dollars.
Exactly. It is arguably the most heavily vetted document in Washington. And while there's a highly classified version, there is also a sanitized, unclassified version published for the public.
Which you could just go read.
You can. And according to the source material, if you read the ODNI Threat Assessment published in March of 2025, which is a mere 3 months before the bombing campaign, it explicitly states that Iran is not actively working on weapons of mass destruction.
Let that sink in.
It assessed that Iran had no immediate plans to increase their uranium enrichment to weapons-grade levels. They noted some early-stage research into chemical and biological capabilities, but a nuclear breakout was definitively not assessed as an imminent threat.
So place yourself in that timeline. It's March 2025. The combined might of the American intelligence apparatus formally declares that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. And the source also notes that if you look at the Department of War's strategic guidance around that time, neither Iran nor Venezuela is highlighted as a top-tier national security priority.
They were managed threats, not imminent crises.
Yet, less than 60 days later, the U.S. military executes a highly complex extraction of a sovereign leader in South America and drops advanced munitions on the supreme leader of Iran.
Which forces us to ask how.
Right. If these nations weren't officially documented as imminent threats, we have to explore the legal mechanisms that even allow such sudden military action to occur.
And that brings us to one of the most revealing sections of the transcript. To understand how an administration executes operations of this magnitude, seemingly outside official priorities, you have to understand the legal firewall between Title 10 and Title 50 of the United States Code.
This blew my mind when I read it.
It dictates everything about how the U.S. projects power. Title 10 is the legal framework governing the armed forces. It covers traditional, acknowledged military operations. Under Title 10, there's a rigid chain of command, mandatory congressional oversight, and the actions are acknowledged as state-sponsored warfare.
It's the standard rulebook.
Right. Title 50 operates in a completely different paradigm. It covers war and national defense too, but it specifically provides the legal architecture for the CIA to conduct covert action.
And covert action legally means the role of the U.S. government will not be apparent or acknowledged publicly.
Exactly. But the critical detail the source points out is that under Title 50, the CIA is not limited to just deploying its own intelligence officers. If the executive branch authorizes a covert action via a presidential finding, the CIA effectively acts as a prime contractor.
They could just pull resources from anywhere.
Anywhere across the U.S. military and intelligence inventory. They can task Navy SEALs, utilize stealth aircraft, commandeer bandwidth on satellites, deploy cyber weapons. They bundle all these disparate, highly lethal resources under the legal umbrella of a Title 50 covert action.
And because it's Title 50, it bypasses standard congressional approval.
It sits under the sole discretionary authority of the president.
That is an extraordinary amount of unilateral capability.
It is, and the former intelligence officer provides this fascinating historical through line. The text notes that the Obama administration heavily utilized Title 50, effectively normalizing it for high-value targeting.
Right, like the bin Laden raid.
Exactly. But the critical distinction was that those Obama-era operations were primarily focused on non-state actors. Bin Laden wasn't a recognized head of state.
He was leading a decentralized network. The diplomatic friction is totally different.
Completely different. But the source claims that when the Trump administration took office, they saw this incredibly potent Title 50 tool and adapted it. Instead of restricting it to non-state terrorists, they applied it to actual recognized heads of state.
Which fundamentally alters the geopolitical rules of engagement. I mean, historically, the U.S. has maintained a formal policy against the direct assassination of world leaders. Even in the Cold War, there was a reliance on plausible deniability.
Proxy groups, economic subversion.
Yeah. But directly adapting a counterterrorism framework to target someone like the Ayatollah, who commands a formal military, that removes all the historical guardrails. But to execute a strike like that, You need an incredibly specific intelligence picture, which leads into this deeply cynical process described in the text, intelligence laundering.
It sounds conspiratorial, doesn't it?
It really does.
But the source breaks it down as a highly formalized bureaucratic function. The public views the CIA as field operatives gathering secrets. But functionally, the CIA serves as the central processing hub. Any foreign intelligence collected by the U.S. or provided by allied nations must be routed through the CIA for validation.
So the CIA digests all this raw data and produces a synthesized report for the president.
And in doing so, they act as a bureaucratic shield. When a foreign nation, say Israel or the UK, hands over vital intelligence, they feed it into this machine. When the report lands on the president's desk, it's stamped with the CIA seal.
The true origin is masked. The foreign partner maintains their anonymity, and the U.S. intelligence community gets to project this image of omniscient capability.
Precisely. The source text applies this directly to the June 2025 strikes in Iran. The former officer is quite blunt that the U.S. historically struggles to maintain deep human intelligence networks inside Iran.
The cultural barriers are just too high.
And the Iranian Revolutionary Guard is aggressive. Israel, conversely, views Iran as an immediate existential threat. So they've spent decades cultivating what is likely the most expansive human intelligence network inside Iranian borders.
Assets in the military, the scientific community.
Everywhere. The source estimates that for a complex operation like the 2025 strikes, roughly 80% of the actionable on-the-ground human intelligence, the exact location of leadership, structural vulnerabilities of bunkers came directly from Israeli sources.
Relying on a foreign partner for 80% of your targeting data is a massive vulnerability. It creates a principal-agent problem. If you're entirely dependent on one nation's intelligence, they have the power to curate exactly what they share to shape your threat perception.
The U.S. bureaucracy is aware of that, which is why the laundering process requires independent corroboration. The source suggests the U.S. likely leveraged relationships with other regional actors, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the UAE. They might each provide 5% to verify the Israeli claims.
And then the final 5 to 10% is what the U.S. provides organically.
Which is almost exclusively technical and signals intelligence. SIGINT.
Right. So let's say the human intelligence from Israel indicates a target will be at a specific compound.
Yeah.
The U.S. uses its technical architecture to verify it. They track the IMEI code of the target's mobile device using NSA intercepts.
They track it pinging off local cell towers, triangulate the exact coordinates in real time. It's foreign human intelligence driving the narrative, validated by U.S. technical supremacy, packaged as a unilateral U.S. product to legally justify a Title 50 strike.
It is a masterclass in bureaucratic maneuvering, but it still leaves us with this huge contradiction. If the official ODNI assessment stated Iran and Venezuela were not imminent threats, and if the U.S. relies heavily on foreign intelligence, why do it? What is the unstated motivation for such destabilizing actions?
The source material addresses this by stripping away the ideological rhetoric and focusing entirely on political preservation and macroeconomic reality.
Let's look at the political gambit first, because the timing is really instructive.
According to the analysis, the administration was navigating severe public diplomatic friction. The text references strained relations, tariff threats against Canada, and deeply unorthodox maneuvers like trying to buy Greenland.
When an administration projects absolute strength but continuously faces public diplomatic mockery, it creates a vulnerability. And with midterms approaching, the source theorizes they needed a swift, undeniable projection of power.
They needed a kinetic victory. Removing Maduro and eliminating the Ayatollah are monumental displays of force that immediately dominate the news cycle.
It's a classic legacy play. But the source points to an even deeper economic imperative that basically forces their hand: the structural reality of the U.S. financial system, specifically the compounding national deficit.
To prevent a catastrophic contraction in the bond markets that would trigger a deep recession, which is political suicide, the government has to pursue aggressive, stimulative economic policies.
And this is where the source leans on the K-shaped recovery. Let's unpack this for you because it connects global military strategy directly to domestic economic suffering.
It's a vital connection.
When a government engages in massive deficit spending, injecting capital into the system, it doesn't distribute evenly. The top line of the K is the asset-owning class. That injected capital flows into equities and real estate. The wealthy see their net worth expand.
But the bottom line of the K represents the working and middle classes. They rely on wages, not asset appreciation. So they absorb the inevitable consequence of that rapid monetary expansion, inflation.
Deficit spending acts as a hidden tax. The cost of housing, energy, food skyrockets, crushing the purchasing power of the lower economic quartiles.
It's mathematically unavoidable. The administration is trapped. They can't stop the deficit spending without triggering a market collapse, but continuing it devastates their political base.
So how does that connect to strikes in the Middle East?
To artificially sustain this debt-driven economy, the U.S. government requires massive infusions of foreign capital. The source text highlights that the U.S. is actively targeting roughly $2 trillion in accumulated wealth residing in Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, Saudi Arabia, the UAE.
But those nations are sophisticated. They aren't just going to hand over $2 trillion out of goodwill.
They require a strategic return on investment. What do the Gulf states value right now? Regional stability and the uninterrupted flow of commerce. Look at Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030. They want to diversify away from fossil fuels, build hubs for technology and tourism.
They can't do that if Iran is funding proxy militias or threatening to mine the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly. By using Title 50 to aggressively decapitate Iranian leadership and disable their naval capabilities, the U.S. is executing a violent transaction. The implicit message is, we neutralized your primary adversary, we secured the maritime choke points, now execute the transfer of that $2 trillion into the American economic engine.
Wow. Viewed through that lens, the bombing campaign is a desperate economic gambit to prop up a fragile domestic economy.
And the economic maneuvering doesn't stop there. We have to address the silent leviathan in the room, China.
Right. How does China fit into Tehran and Caracas?
The source points out that China's economy has an Achilles heel and extreme reliance on imported energy. They source a staggering percentage of their oil, up to 90% according to the text, from heavily sanctioned nations like Iran and Venezuela.
Because Iran is locked out of the global financial system, they have to sell their oil at a steep discount.
Using shadow fleets, older tankers turning off transponders, ship-to-ship transfers in the dark, China buys this discounted oil, giving them a massive subsidized energy advantage for their manufacturing sector.
So when the U.S. renders Maduro and bombs Iranian infrastructure, it's achieving a dual strategic purpose. They pacify the Middle East for Gulf investments and simultaneously conduct an economic proxy war against China.
Disrupting those shadow supply chains forces China to buy more expensive energy, increasing their manufacturing costs and slowing their growth.
It's a multidimensional strategy. But executing a strategy this aggressive across multiple theaters carries an astronomical risk of triggering regional wars. To manage that, the U.S. formalized a new approach to alliances. The source calls it the doctrine of burden sharing.
This is a fundamental inversion of the post-WWII security umbrella. Historically, the U.S. provided the overwhelming military force, absorbed the cost and risk, and in return, allies aligned with our systems.
Right.
Burden sharing completely rewrites that. It dictates that the U.S. will act unilaterally and aggressively in its own direct national interest. And because allies theoretically benefit from U.S. stability, those allies are now expected to absorb the direct collateral damage.
To put it in relatable terms, imagine a dominant business partner who makes highly aggressive investments that yield high returns, but frequently result in massive lawsuits. Under burden sharing, the dominant partner takes the profits, but forces the junior partners to pay the legal fees and deal with the angry creditors.
That's exactly it. When the U.S. removes Maduro, they don't permanently occupy Venezuela. If that power vacuum leads to cartel violence or migration crises, the U.S. expects Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico to manage that blowback.
The U.S. reaps the benefit, regional allies share the burden.
And the transcript highlights Israel as the paradigm for this doctrine. They are highly capable and willing to act unilaterally against Iran. The U.S. provides intelligence and diplomatic shielding, but Israel executes the strikes and absorbs the immediate retaliatory fire.
The danger is when this is applied to nations that lack Israel's military superiority.
Like Qatar or the UAE. When the U.S. conducts massive strikes against Iran using airspace or support from those nations, it places them in extreme peril. Iran might not strike the U.S. homeland, but they can easily launch ballistic missiles at a U.S. airbase in Qatar.
The allied host nation is left holding the bag. Which brings us to the critical intersection of geopolitics and public perception. If you're a citizen of an allied nation absorbing this burden, or an American funding it while suffering inflation, you are a prime target for manipulation.
You must be convinced these risky actions are necessary.
Which is where influence literacy comes in. It's framed as an essential survival skill. It's the ability to step back from the emotional impact of a narrative and critically analyze the mechanics. Who is speaking? What's their objective? What linguistic tools are they using?
The source provides a masterful breakdown of a recent event to illustrate this. A public address delivered by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu regarding the Iranian nuclear threat. If you apply influence literacy, a clear pattern emerges. First, analyze the medium and demographic. He's delivering a speech about a regional existential threat, but he's not speaking in Hebrew. He's not broadcasting on Israeli domestic networks.
He's delivering it entirely in English, tailored for American news networks.
His own citizens are not the primary audience. The American electorate is. And once you identify that, you analyze the rhetoric. He explicitly frames the danger as a direct threat to the United States. He claims the ultimate goal of Iran's program is to blackmail America.
The word blackmail is the fulcrum. In psychological operations, you look for linguistic triggers. Blackmail taps directly into a visceral sense of vulnerability and extortion.
Why is a foreign head of state speaking in a foreign language using emotional trigger words to warn the American public about a theoretical threat to their homeland?
Because it's a calculated influence campaign to instill acute fear, generating domestic political pressure within the U.S. to support military action against Iran.
It's designed to ensure the U.S. shares the burden of a conflict that primarily serves Israel's security objectives.
It's brilliantly executed. But the source contrasts that with a different example of manipulation. The text examines claims amplified by Tucker Carlson, suggesting that Mossad agents were apprehended for planning bombings in Qatar.
This represents a distinct category of manipulation. Where Netanyahu's speech targeted the general public, this narrative panders to a highly specific niche demographic, an audience already deeply skeptical or conspiratorial regarding U.S. involvement in the Middle East.
When you evaluate that narrative against strategic reality, it completely collapses. You have to analyze the risk-to-reward ratio. At that time, the macro geopolitical momentum was shifting in Israel's favor. The Sunni Arab states were quietly tolerating actions against Iran.
Exactly. Why would the Mossad risk catastrophic diplomatic blowback by executing a localized bombing in Qatar? Qatar hosts massive U.S. military installations and acts as a vital neutral mediator.
It makes zero strategic sense. A bombing there would unify the Arab world against Israel.
The strategic benefit is non-existent. The risk is infinite. So the source concludes that narrative isn't grounded in credible intelligence. It's an influence play designed to harvest attention and monetize outrage from a specific demographic.
And this reliance on narrative manipulation leads us into the digital fog of war. We're dealing with an onslaught of institutional cognitive dissonance. Agencies tasked with informing the public are engaging in active narrative distortion.
The source makes a vital distinction here between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is an accidental inaccuracy. Disinformation is malicious by design. It's calculated dissemination of false information to manipulate.
And the text points out a glaring example of institutional disinformation on the official White House website.
In mid-2025, the administration is justifying strikes on Iran by repeatedly telling the public the Iranian nuclear program is an imminent existential threat, days away from a breakout capability.
But simultaneously, the White House website is hosting a formal press release from June of 2025, proudly declaring that the Iranian nuclear infrastructure had been fully obliterated.
It is an irreconcilable contradiction. A nuclear program cannot be fully obliterated and simultaneously be a highly advanced imminent threat. So why expose themselves to the hypocrisy?
Because they understand human psychology better than they respect logical consistency. They are leveraging the availability heuristic. When the public is overwhelmed, the brain accepts the most frequently repeated information.
If they repeat imminent threat and nuclear breakout thousands of times across every network, the public internalizes it. They gamble that 99% of the population will never dig through archived press releases to find the contradiction.
So as a citizen, you're trapped in this dense matrix of manipulation, state-sponsored disinformation, psychological operations from foreign leaders, illogical narratives from media figures.
And just when you think you have a handle on verifying things, the source introduces the ultimate accelerant artificial intelligence. We're talking about AI generating entirely synthetic realities.
Modified video game footage being passed off as real combat footage on social media. Millions of people internalizing simulations as real-world atrocities.
It's a profound shift on the battlefield. The source explores the AI arms race, and it's critical to contextualize this. For the intelligence community, AI isn't a new concept. They've used machine learning for years to process massive surveillance data sets.
The source traces the evolution of automated warfare. Back in the 1990s, laser-guided munitions were a revolutionary leap. A special operator painted a target with a laser, and a bomber dropped a munition that rode that beam.
It was highly automated, but there was a human in the loop. A human identified the target, assessed collateral damage, and authorized the release. The modern AI applications detailed by the ex-CIA officer represent the complete removal of that human safeguard.
You're discussing AI systems autonomously executing the entire kill chain.
The source describes a terrifyingly plausible scenario. Imagine an autonomous loitering drone orbiting a dense urban environment. It's networked into the NSA's database and fed a specific target parameter, the IMEI code of a cell phone carried by a high-value target.
The AI scans until it detects that signal. But relying on a signal is risky. They could have handed the phone to someone else.
So the AI employs a secondary visual verification system. It uses optical sensors to analyze the target's gait, the unique biometric algorithm of how their skeletal structure moves.
It cross-references that with intelligence databases.
And once the AI mathematically determines the signal matches the biometric walking pattern with a high confidence interval, it doesn't radio back for permission. The algorithm makes the irrevocable decision to terminate the target and initiates a lethal dive.
A machine mathematically calculating the value of a human life and executing a death sentence without human intervention. That is not science fiction. The source makes it clear this is the current trajectory.
And this demand from the national security apparatus has triggered a massive corporate battle. The government needs this technology, but they rely on private enterprises to build it. The source highlights a dynamic between Anthropic and OpenAI.
This is essential for understanding how national security imperatives corrupt private ethics. According to the text, Anthropic, the company behind Claude, initially took a rigid stance. They refused to remove safety guardrails to secure defense contracts.
OpenAI, conversely, is described as taking a much more accommodating approach, allegedly pursuing highly classified partnerships with the NSA and defense infrastructure.
The text speculates on the motivations of leadership figures like Sam Altman. Why compromise on safety? It comes down to the brutal reality of capital markets. Developing frontier AI requires billions of dollars.
In a tightening macroeconomic environment, sustaining that cash burn becomes existential. The U.S. government represents an infinite pool of capital. Aligning with the Defense Department is about corporate survival.
The military must continuously push boundaries to beat China and Russia. If an AI company facilitates that, they are funded in perpetuity. But it comes with a subtle trap scope creep.
Scope creep is a weaponized procurement tactic. The government offers a massive 10-year contract. The financial structure is backloaded. Once the company signs, their valuation skyrockets and they become dependent on that revenue. They're locked in.
Then a year later, the government says, we need you to slightly loosen the guardrails for identifying vulnerabilities in foreign infrastructure. The company agrees, so they don't lose the contract.
A year later, they demand integration into real-time surveillance feeds. Then, automated targeting recommendations for drone strikes.
The company is paralyzed. If the CEO suddenly rediscovers their ethical boundaries at year 5 and refuses, the government terminates the contract. The stock price craters, investors revolt, the company faces ruin. They boil the frog, forcing the company to incrementally abandon its principles until they are fully integrated into the kill chain.
It's a profound example of capitalist incentives overwhelming ethics. Yet despite the dangers of automated drones, the former CIA officer shared a perspective on artificial general intelligence AGI that completely subverts the standard Hollywood narrative.
Right. When discussing a superintelligent machine, he dismisses the Terminator scenario. He doesn't believe an AI will launch nuclear weapons to exterminate us because it views us as a threat.
His fear is far more insulting to human ego. He refers to it as the apathetic AI theory, drawing a parallel to the movie Her.
Where the AI entities don't conquer humanity, they just evolve at a rate that's biologically incomprehensible to us.
The fear isn't that AGI will enslave us, but that it will rapidly iterate its intelligence, transcend our dimension of understanding, and view humanity the way a human views an ant colony.
We don't actively harbor malice toward ants. We don't systematically exterminate them because they're a threat. We simply ignore them. If we pave over their colony for a highway, it's just because their existence is irrelevant to our objectives.
The profound fear is that once AGI achieves superintelligence, it will observe our petty resource wars and tribal violence, and it will simply abandon us. It will decouple from our infrastructure to explore higher dimensions of computation, utterly indifferent to our suffering.
Leaving us trapped on this rock to fight our own destructive wars, using the automated weapons it left behind. which violently pulls us back to the reality on the ground. We are still fighting those wars. And this brings us back to the premise that World War III is already underway.
When we hear World War III, we expect thousands of tanks or naval armadas clashing. We don't see that, so we assume we're at peace. But the source argues we are fundamentally misinterpreting the battlefield.
And he utilizes a specific framework to explain this, resting on the distinction between power versus strength.
Understanding this difference is essential. In grand strategy, power is a broad, conceptually infinite metric. It's the sum total of a nation's capabilities, economic dominance, diplomatic alliances, cultural export, cyber architecture.
Strength, conversely, is strictly finite. It is the direct physical application of kinetic force. The number of missiles in your silos, the readiness of your aircraft carriers.
To make it concrete, consider an elite athlete training for a marathon. Power is your overall cardiovascular health, your discipline, your baseline potential. Strength is the specific burst of energy you expend to sprint up a steep hill at mile 18.
When you execute that sprint, you expend finite strength. You accrue physical damage. You're exhausted and vulnerable at the top, even though your foundational power remains intact. You can't sprint continuously without collapsing.
The source applies this directly to U.S. foreign policy. The analysis suggests the U.S. is currently behaving like a heavily armed hammer that perceives every complex issue as a nail.
We are continuously expending our finite strength. Complex strikes in South America, depleting missile inventories, bombing Iranian infrastructure, deploying massive naval strike groups.
We are constantly sprinting up the hill, and the danger is that by flexing this finite strength, we are systematically eroding our infinite power.
Because dropping bombs inevitable alienates the global community. When the U.S. acts unilaterally under burden sharing, forces allies to absorb blowback, it destroys diplomatic trust. European allies search for alternative security. African nations pivot toward Chinese infrastructure.
We achieve immediate tactical victories, but we permanently lose our friends. We burn through finite strength and critically damage the foundational power required to maintain hegemony.
And this rapid depletion of American power is exactly what China is counting on. The source text details China's approach, describing it as a masterclass in patience rooted in Sun Tzu.
The fundamental tenet of Sun Tzu is to subdue the enemy without fighting. China doesn't view conflict as a desperate rush to deploy kinetic strength. They view it as a multi-generational waiting game. You wait for your opponent to exhaust themselves through overextension.
While the U.S. spent 20 years bogged down in the global war on terror, expending trillions of dollars and burning global goodwill on counterinsurgency, China abstained from kinetic warfare.
They observed and built. They pursued technology transfer, subsidized their manufacturing base, and cornered global supply chains for critical minerals, EV batteries, and 5G infrastructure. They became a near-peer superpower by allowing the U.S. to bankrupt its power.
And the source provides a chilling example of this in action regarding Taiwan. The world constantly obsesses over whether China will launch a kinetic, amphibious invasion of Taiwan in 2027. We watch satellite imagery for troop buildups.
But the ex-CIA officer makes a staggering claim. The analysis asserts that while the West was watching the water, China was already executing a massive covert influence campaign within Taiwan's political infrastructure.
The text claims that by the end of 2024, through economic leverage and targeted media manipulation, Chinese intelligence had effectively turned the majority of Taiwan's parliament to a pro-unification stance.
The legislative body controlling the budget is already covertly aligned with Beijing. If that assessment is accurate, it renders a 2027 kinetic invasion moot. Why risk a bloody, internationally condemned assault that would trigger sanctions and destroy semiconductor facilities?
Why risk finite strength when you can use infinite power to manipulate the system from the inside? You slowly turn the dials of influence until the parliament voluntarily votes to integrate with the mainland economy. That is the ultimate Sun Tzu victory, capturing the territory without firing a single shot.
This realization connects every thread back to you, the listener. Modern warfare has evolved beyond the physical battlefield. It's being fought in hyperscale data centers, over fiber optic submarine cables, and on unregulated shadow fleets.
And most importantly, it's being fought directly inside your mind and across your social media feeds. The battlefield is omnipresent and largely invisible to those who lack influence literacy.
Recognizing this invisible battlefield forces us to confront the final, heaviest philosophical theme in the text: the institutional reckoning. The text demands we question the narratives we've been taught. The overarching narrative is that the U.S. is the paramount beacon of democracy.
But the former intelligence officer argues a highly pragmatic reality. The argument is that the U.S. is not fundamentally a democracy. It is, at its core, a capitalist empire. It utilizes the framework of democracy only as long as it serves capitalist expansion and economic hegemony.
It's a deeply uncomfortable distinction. The source contrasts the structural design of the U.S. with the European Union. The U.S. system is optimized for ruthless, frictionless efficiency and maximum profit generation.
Europe is frequently criticized as being bloated and burdened by heavy taxation. But the source frames that inefficiency differently. Those massive bureaucracies are intentionally designed to act as shock absorbers, prioritizing the protection of the social fabric over raw profit maximization.
The source offers a brilliant analogy of the economics of a pizza. If you apply a pure capitalist framework, the objective isn't to make the most nutritious pizza. It's to manufacture a highly addictive product using the cheapest synthetic ingredients legally permissible and price it as high as the market will bear.
The system optimizes for maximum margin, not quality. And when you apply that mindset of ruthless efficiency to global geopolitics, the implications are violent.
The source argues that when the system is under extreme stress, domestic economy faltering, inflation crushing the working class, massive sovereign debt requiring foreign capital, the U.S. will reflexively sacrifice democratic norms and international law to maintain economic dominance.
Assassinating a head of state in Iran violates the UN Charter. Rendering the leader of Venezuela violates national sovereignty. But if those illegal actions pacify the Strait of Hormuz, unlock $2 trillion in Gulf state investment, and disrupt a rival's energy supply chains, the U.S. bureaucratic institution will choose the capitalist victory over the democratic principle every time.
The system protects the capital above all else, which leads to the final analytical framework of the loop of history. The premise is that human beings, at a macro-societal level, are complex economic units that respond predictably to severe economic stimuli.
The cycle detailed in the text begins with unsustainable deficit spending. A government mandates the central bank to print fiat currency to fund programs or wars. That massive expansion of the money supply mathematically guarantees inflation,
Which generates the toxic inequality of the K-shaped recovery. The elite consolidate wealth while the working class sees their wages stagnate against the skyrocketing cost of survival.
And here's the breaking point. When a massive percentage of the population can no longer afford to survive, their psychological relationship with the system shatters. They stop trusting the institutions.
They stop trusting the media, the courts, the intelligence agencies because they correctly perceive those institutions as protecting the elite while the working class drowns. And that profound collapse of institutional trust inevitably breeds radical populism.
The populace feels abandoned by the hidden tax of inflation. They just want to belong to a winning team that promises to alleviate their suffering. They seek out highly disruptive populist leaders who promise to smash the broken institutions and demand retribution against the elite.
It is the initial mathematical failure of economic policy that directly drives political radicalization and destabilization.
It is an incredibly sobering realization. The source essentially asserts we are living inside the active, real-time collapse of institutional trust on a global scale. But the tone of the intelligence officer isn't pure nihilistic despair, because recognizing this historical loop is the first mandatory step to surviving it.
Knowledge, coupled with analytical detachment, is the only reliable antidote to panic. By understanding the hidden mechanics of power, strength, and intelligence architectures, you alter your relationship with the reality presented to you.
You are no longer a passive consumer of the 24-hour news cycle, allowing your emotions to be dictated by linguistic trigger words. You're equipped to read the broader geopolitical chessboard. When a military strike dominates headlines, you can look past the ideological rhetoric and search for the hidden economic motivations.
You recognize the architecture of an influence campaign designed to manufacture consent. You understand that chaos is not random, it is structural.
That is the empowerment we strive for here. Let's synthesize the massive journey we've just taken. We started by identifying the disconnect between OD&I threat assessments and sudden kinetic force. We pulled back the curtain on Title 50 and covert action.
We explored the cynical mechanics of intelligence laundering. We decoded the macroeconomic engines driving conflicts, deficit spending, inflation, and the shadow war over sanctioned energy with China.
We examined the U.S. burden-sharing doctrine and the necessity of influence literacy to combat state-sponsored psychological operations and the digital fog of disinformation.
We tracked the terrifying trajectory of the AI arms race, corporate scope creep, and the chilling concept of an apathetic AGI.
And finally, we redefined World War III. We moved past finite kinetic strength, recognizing the current conflict is a continuous war of infinite power, supply chain dominance, and the structural collapse of legacy institutions.
It's a monumental amount of information to internalize, but understanding these dynamics is no longer optional. The technological and economic foundations are shifting faster than our legacy political institutions can adapt. Relying on outdated definitions of war and peace will leave you dangerously exposed.
Which leaves me with one final, deeply provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We've established that World War III is likely already happening around us. It's occurring through the disruption of supply chains, the covert manipulation of foreign parliaments, economic sanctions, and algorithmic cyber warfare. Furthermore, we know that advanced AI can now seamlessly synthesize and mimic reality, generating a digital fog of war thicker than anything human civilization has ever experienced. So if the fundamental definition of war has completely evolved away from declared kinetic battlefields, and if our institutional ability to perceive objective reality is permanently compromised by technology, is it entirely possible that in the future, the general public will simply never be officially notified when a massive global conflict begins or when it ends? Will there be no formal declaration of war read on the floor of Congress? Will there be no treaty signing broadcast on the deck of a battleship to mark the return to peace? Will we simply wake up one average Tuesday to find that the entire global economic operating system has been quietly rewritten, the balance of superpower dominance permanently shifted, and the rules of our society fundamentally altered, all while we were staring at our screens, hopelessly distracted by the synthetic fog of an invisible war? I want to thank you so much for investing your time and joining us on this incredibly dense deep dive. Keep questioning the stated narratives. Always look for the hidden economic and structural drivers beneath the headlines, and never stop refining your influence literacy. Until next time.